The Wichita Weavers, Spinners, and Dyers Guild in South Central Kansas held its October 2020 meeting via Zoom, again. Although we can't get together in person yet, we can still share ideas. My name is Sharon Barnes, and I presented the program on online color resources. This is a brief look at some basic color theory and an overview of some websites I found. I hope you'll see something that piques your interest. Three basic components of color are hue, red, green, and blue. This is a not quite standard color wheel. The sharp-eyed among you will notice that red and green are not opposite each other. And there are other color wheels as well, such as CMY or CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black, used in printing, and also in mixing fiber colors. Then there's value, which is the light to dark element. It's best seen in a grayscale photo. We'll come back to that in just a minute. And then there's saturation. It's the vividness, or some people call it muddiness, desaturation, or intensity of a color. You can desaturate a pure color by blending it with white, gray, or black, or by blending it with a complementary color. Blending it with white, gray, or black will also give you tones or shades more specifically. This is a site where you can download various color wheels, and you can print these if you think that would be useful to you. Here's an example of value. This is actually a knitted swatch that I did some years ago, and here it is in full color. And it doesn't look too bad, but when you change it to grayscale, you see that there's not really enough contrast in these two areas to make the design pop. So this is an example of where looking at the value of various colors will give you a better idea of how they work together. And this site is a lot of fun to play with to create gradients or gradations, and I like to use it in blending complementary colors so you can see a gradient from one color on the color wheel across to its opposite, and through some interesting, some people might call them muddy, but I think they're beautiful and complex intermediary colors. So we'll start, let's get an orange here. We'll start with an orange, and then we'll pick a blue. And let's say we want to do 5 intermediate steps, and then I'll click blend. And there you go. Since the orange is kind of on the bluish side rather than the yellow side, it's a cooler orange, you can see that the intermediate colors are also a little bluish. So they go kind of into an interesting purpley. This would be a great gradient to indicate sunset. So this is a really fun site to play with. You'll also see that each one of these colors has a hexadecimal value. You can also change it to RGB or RGB percentage. We'll come back and look at this towards the end. Here are a couple of real-life textile fiber examples. This picture and the next one show some dye workshop examples done by the late Martha Crowley, who was a guild member a number of years ago. This one goes from a bright red to medium blue-green and has some interesting intermediary colors as well. And this one is an example of gold to purple, and it produced some beautiful complex browns in the middle, some really neat shades. Weavers sometimes have a problem with bright colors turning into mud. It's not just weavers, but the interaction of woven strands is different sometimes than that of, say, knitted fabric. And this site author talks about that as well. Here you can see this is the CMY color wheel, not RGB. And we'll just scroll down through some of this information. And here is the example that she's going to show us, a magenta and a bright green. And if you throw those two together, it comes out kind of a light olive color, which may or may not be the effect that you want. Here is another example in red and blue, magenta and blue, which combines into a kind of interesting purple. But since magenta and green are farther apart on the color wheel, when you put these two together in a plain weave, you get a more indistinct color. You get optical blending because they're tiny dots of color that the eye kind of merges like a pointillist painting. And it may not be the effect that the weaver wants, but using the same warp and weft in a different weave lets the colors shine through. So just changing the weave itself can change the appearance of the same two colors. Here are a couple of interesting rules about color theory, specifically in weaving. And this is actually the same example on the previous site. But again, if you mix two colors in small dots, you'll get the optical blending. But you mix those two colors in larger blocks and they stand out from each other. The same holds true to painted warps, and when those are woven with black, you get different effects with the smaller and the larger amounts of color. And the other rule is that the eye perceives differences in value very clearly, sometimes more clearly than it sees the hues. If you remember back to the comparison of the knitted color and grayscale images, the differences popped out very clearly in the grayscale, and subconsciously our eyes really pick out those differences in value. This is about color gamps. I was not familiar with this, not being much of a weaver, but if I was going to weave a project, it would probably be something like this. I have always loved these kinds of woven fabrics, and they're wonderful color studies, but this site goes a little deeper and talks about how the different weaves also change the way the colors interact with each other. And there are several examples here and some ideas if you're going to design your own. Away from weaving and into knitting. This is an interesting site that has some value examples, and it talks a bit about values to start out with, and also uses the color and black and white images to illustrate that. This author has some examples, and this is one that she talked about. She said, "I have been teaching color theory workshops for 5 years when I made this decision about the colors to use for this shawl prototype." You know, they're fine colors. She did a quick squint and didn't really like the way these were coming together, medium light and medium dark only. And yes, they're distinct from each other, but it doesn't really pop. And she writes that participants all, frequently say, "Oh, this is not so bad." But then she compares it to this one, which, yes, that one really does, that one nails it. And here it is in grayscale as well. So choosing a wider range of light, medium light, and dark values really makes this complete and eye-pleasing. And here are a few hints for selecting a colorwork palette for stranded knitting, which can be complicated because there are frequently a lot of colors 10, 12 more colors or shades that are used in a project. One of the interesting things I found in this site illustrates is the proportion of colors makes a big difference. And here is one where the 3 colors are equal. Here's one where they're in a different percentage. And again, this is just more pleasing, maybe for a somewhat indefinable reason. And this one also are much more interesting. And you can change the values of the main and second colors so they are related but different. And these are some examples here. This example shows that the values are too close together for good contrast, and so the actual pattern of the shapes doesn't come out, and you don't see the floral or the figures of these shapes because they don't contrast enough with the background. And here's an example where there's much better contrast. Although, in my opinion, it would be a little bit better if that center blue was just a little bit darker, but those are beautiful colors that go well together. Now let's have a look at creating a palette. There are a lot of different websites that you can play with, and we'll just look at a few of them. This one is kind of fun because it's so random. And you can just hit the space bar and get, again, just random combinations. You can change these, you can tweak them, you can select a color. This number right here is the hexadecimal color designation, and we'll look at this again a little bit later. You can do quite a bit with all of these sites. This one you can do a lot. I've only dabbled in it a little bit, but it's really fun. And you can go from a monochromatic to adjacent colors to a triad. You can do split. I don't know if this one will do split complementary. You can do custom ones. And then you can edit these colors. You can unlock them, you can change them, you can play with them in lots of different ways. You can change the hue, you can fine tune it to change in lots of different ways, and this is your outcome that you can play with. This is another really interesting and fun site just to play with as well. You can choose analogous, monochromatic, so you go different values of the same hue. Triads, complementary, split complementary. You can play with them and move them around. You can move them in or out to play with the saturation. And you can really have a good time. And then you also get a wide number of variations on each of these. In addition to all the interesting things that you can do with online color wheels, you can also create a color palette from an image. This is one of my favorite free sites for images that are not copyright protected. And so you can just pick any one of these images. Oh, let's go with this one. And what we want to do is get the URL for this particular image. So right-click and click Copy Image Location. You want this to be a URL that ends in JPEG or png.png. We'll hang on to that for a second, and this is a site, we're not going to do this, but this is a site where you can upload your own image. Some of these others you have the option, and so I wanted to show you this one first, and then we'll play with this one So we'll paste the URL in here and see that it does end with JPEG, and let it go to work. Okay, here we are. This is a nice palette, but it doesn't really reflect the image very well, so I'm going to change some of those. No, let's do something a little bit lighter. That's brighter. And I want a different green here. And maybe lighten that green a little bit. And that one, I think, reflects the image a little bit better than the original one. Now let's see what happens when we go to a different site that does the same thing. And I'm going to paste that URL, the same one. And it gives me a completely different palette. Let's say this one I want the deeper blue, and this I want some of that white. And maybe instead of that red, again I want a brighter green. And this one just really needs to be deeper. And so I can play with that one if I want to. You can export these, or you can look at the individual colors. And let's go back to another site, and we'll pick this particular color for the next demonstration. This is the hex color. I can copy that, or I can change and look at the RGB, which is 82, 153, and 211. Now, let's say I want to actually dye this color. 82, 153, and 211. And this is going to be on a protein fiber. So I'm going to enter those. This gives me a percentage of dyes from RGB or CMYK. It's kind of a converter. If you're actually going to dye using some of these, there will be a certain amount of experimenting to do. But this gives you a lot of information on the percentage, the stock solution, how much fiber you want, weight of fiber, depth of shade, lots of information in order to get you pretty close to that color that you put in. So it's a really interesting concept, and I think would be a lot of fun to play with if you were going to do a color study with dye. Let's look at this in a different way. If I couldn't get the RGB, if all I had was the hex or hexadecimal, let me copy that. And then go to another resource on CoWeaves, C-O-E Weaves. And this one is a color code calculator. So if I put in the hexadecimal one and it displays the color, just so I know, that tells me also that it's 82, 153, and 211 is the RGB. Or if I want to do CMYK, this tells me the numbers for that. So these are, I think, some really fun ideas to play with, and I hope that you found something that is worth investigating on your own. And I appreciate your listening. Please feel free to look us up at wichitaweavers.org or drop by for a visit on Facebook.